Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Madhavanti Ghosh, and I'm the Oldstop Associate Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan art at the Art Institute. Today's program focuses our attention on how research has refined scholarship, enriched provenance records, and shed new light into the Khmer collection at the Art Institute of Chicago. Together, these efforts help uncover more accurate histories and strengthen the stories we share. As we begin, a brief reminder, please, to silence your mobile devices. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's program, Dr. Nicolas Revire. Nicolas is the Daniel F. and Ada L. Rice Research Fellow at the Art Institute of Chicago. Born in France, he holds a doctoral degree and specializes in Hindu and Buddhist art of early Southeast Asia, particularly pre-modern Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia. Nicolas brings expertise from 2 decades of teaching and research in Southeast Asia. He's currently the managing editor of the Journal of the Siam Society. So please join me in welcoming our speaker onto the stage as he presents the lecture, Gods, Temples, and Kings, the Story of Khmer Art in Chicago.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madhu, for the introduction. And thank you all for coming to this lecture today on St. Nicholas Day. So I did not bring any treats or chocolate for you, but I do have a lot of slides. So we're here for a treat today. Gods, Temples, and Kings, the story of Khmer art in Chicago. Gods, kings, and divine beings play an extraordinarily important role across ancient cultures everywhere. However, in the East, they often operate quite differently from the royal and sacred figures many of us know from Western traditions, both in their visual forms, in the way communities venerate them. The stories and rituals are inseparable from the landscapes and peoples who shape them, especially in the ancient Khmer world of Southeast Asia. Yet when we look across Khmer history, we see shifting borders, expanding and contracting kingdoms, and cultural spheres that overlap in complex ways. Traditions move across regions, and influences circulate in many directions. These blurred boundaries make it challenging for scholars and museum curators to neatly classify artworks or determine their precise origins. So over the past 3 years at the Art Institute of Chicago, much of my work has focused on navigating this complexity and trying to bring some clarity where possible so that audiences can engage with these cultures in a richer and more informed ways. So this presentation today builds on these themes, exploring how gods, temples, and kings shape the visual world of the Khmer Empire, and showing how ongoing research continues to shed light on these objects housed at the Art Institute of Chicago. So this is the Alsdorf Galleries right next to us, where most of the Southeast Asian artwork is on display, in terms of sculptures at least. And as you may know, a few of Khmer art objects are currently on view. This is a brief overview of the collection. We house approximately, in a permanent collection, around 50 objects, mostly sculptures. Also, we do have a few ceramics as well, made of metal, stone, or terracotta. And they've been acquired for over 100 years now, with its first acquisitions made as a purchase in 1924. And with the most recent acquisitions made of gifts around 2017. So over 100 years of acquisitions of Khmer art at the Art Institute of Chicago. Well, not everything is on view. We do have objects on view, which I invite you to visit afterwards. And however, all of it is currently published online in our online catalog. And so these pieces are originating from modern Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, as far as we know. So few objects are currently on display at Gallery 142, towards the end of the Azov galleries as you enter the modern wing. And just for those of you who may not be very familiar with the region, so we are talking about the Khmer Empire medieval period from approximately the 9th century with the foundation of the Khmer Empire of Angkor in 802. And with its maximum extent going over the region of mainland Southeast Asia, so comprising today the modern kingdoms of Thailand, Cambodia we mentioned, but also Laos and Vietnam to some extent. So our collection spans from what we call the pre-Angkor period. Those are the few centuries that precede the official establishment of Angkor in 802, from somewhere in the 7th, 8th century, with the coming of Indianized cultures coming from South Asia, with the bringing of religions such as Hinduism, Brahmanism, Buddhism. So here's a couple of snapshots, quick snapshots to show you what we typically have in a collection in different scales. Small example of Lord Ganesha, well known by its elephant head, Hindu god, son of god Shiva, possibly dating from around the 7th to the 8th century. These are approximate dating. We do not have absolute dating for these pieces, unfortunately, and coming from somewhere in the region of mainland Southeast Asia. And to the right is a tiny standing sculpture of a bodhisattva. What is a bodhisattva? These are Sanskrit terms. It's a being destined to become a Buddha in the future. So that's, if you will, a future Buddha, of which the precise identification is not certain. The figure, unfortunately, misses several attributes to definitely recognize it. Again, possibly from Northeast Thailand, not absolutely certain. And this piece is made of bronze. So that's an interesting part of our collection as well. The guardian lion you see on the left is welcoming visitors as you enter the Asdorf galleries coming from the modern wing. So typically, there are, of course, no lions in mainland Southeast Asia, but these are sort of mythical figures, and who probably, we think, served in the capacity of guarding a sacred space, a temple, basically. And to the right, you see a popular goddess known as Durga. Durga is one of the name manifestation of Shiva's consort. And here she is depicted as in her angry manifestation as slaying the buffalo demon, possibly dating from the 10th century also. Chronologically speaking, from around the 11th century, we have miniature Buddhist bronze images of goddess or dancing beauties known as apsaras, in the celestial dancers, who may be related to some Buddhist themes here. The very popular Bodhisattva, future Buddha, Avalokiteshvara, he is known in Sanskrit. He can carry different names. He is also known in Cambodia, ancient Cambodia, as Lokeshvara. People know him in China as Kuan Im, Kwannon in Japan, etc. So this is all the same bodhisattva. We can take different manifestations and forms. So here is recognizable by his seated little Buddha here on the chignon. So typically a way to identify this bodhisattva. And this bodhisattva may be dating from what art historians call the Bayon period of the 12th, 13th century of the Angkor era. A crowned head of probably a god, maybe a king. We do not really know. Sometimes there are blurring lines between kings and gods in Khmer tradition. And again, dating by its style from the Bayon period, we think, 12th, 13th century. This is a gift. This came to us, has been on a long loan from many decades until it was finally acquired in 1964. It came from Mr. Russell Tyson, who's been a prominent donor in the early 20th century at the Art Institute of Chicago for Asian art especially. I believe he was a trustee as well at some point. And so here is another close-up map of the region where you see the great capital of Angkor. Okay, so that's what most people associate with the Khmer Empire, but that is only the capital. And then we can also visualize different provincial towns and capitals all over the kingdom or the empire with a maximum extent, we think, going towards the border of contemporary Myanmar to northern Thailand, northeast Thailand, borders with Laos, and again, lower the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam today. Okay, so what you see in green here is the modern border of Cambodia. So it's often an assumption that Khmer art is equivalent to Cambodia. That is definitely true, but you have to think in those days, in the medieval period, the borders were completely different. There was no border, basically, and the maximum extent of influence and control around the 12th, 13th century was way beyond what is known as Cambodia today. And one of the great kings from the late Angkor period, the so-called Bayon period of the 12th, 13th century, is this Buddhist king known as Jayavarman VII. So a victorious one, protected by victory. That is the translation of his name, basically, Jayavarman in Sanskrit. Okay? So he was one of the few known Buddhist kings of the period. Most other kings would profess worship towards either Shiva or Vishnu, two prominent Hindu gods in Hinduism. From probably the late or even post-Bayon period, so that put us toward probably the late 13th century, if not later, what we call the late Angkor period, is this beautiful bronze image of God Shiva. So Shiva can be manifested in two forms. Anthropomorphic form, as here, as a human, king or ascetic. Here, basically, Shiva is represented as the great ascetic by his beard and ascetic dress and hairdo. You also see some attributes, some attributes here of a little snake here and the Brahmanical cord, which identify him. There is unfortunately missing arm, left arm, who probably would have held his trident. So the trident is the common attribute of Lord Shiva. But Lord Shiva can also be identified in aniconic form, and that is in the form of a lingam or the phallus, symbol of fertility. All right, so what I'm hoping to do today for the core presentation is to walk you through some of my research, some of my work, and how research looked like in action, behind the scene, so that it's not just simply coming to the office and sit behind a computer, but there was a lot of action in storage. First, I had to go through each object carefully, which are kept safely in storage. So here is one sculpture in particular that has a particular interest, a kneeling, half-kneeling figure of probably sort of a deity, semi-gods, which probably served in the capacity of guarding a sacred space or a temple, some sort of configuration in a cardinal direction. And this figure was not quite identified, has not been possible to really identify it, but upon looking at it more closely, we find certain attributes. And particularly, if you see on the back, a little skeleton defect, which identified him as a hunchback. Okay? So figures of hunchback are pretty rare, but not unknown in Khmer art from the Angkorian period. And so that makes it quite interesting. So it adds up to a growing corpus of hunchback images that we know from certain places throughout the Khmer Empire. And that is an image that came very early to us in 1924. I'll come back to this group of images later during my talk. Also in storage, we have some fragments of sculptures, heads. Here is the head of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, but not just a common one. This is quite a rare representation of Avalokiteshvara. If you look more closely in here, you do see small miniature Buddha images. You see those? And so these allow us, scholars, to identify this representation of a radiating Avalokiteshvara, as we call it. What is a radiating form of Avalokiteshvara? It's a rare form where the Bodhisattva of great compassion emanate, irradiate the Buddha's teaching, basically. And how does it do that, visually speaking? Well, the artist thought of, so this is just a drawing, early drawing, showing you multiple miniature lines of rows of miniature Buddhas on his body, which adorn the body of the Bodhisattva so that he can literally irradiate the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha. And so these images are pretty rare. We only know of approximately a dozen of them in various collections. And they are all dating from the Bayon period, which is associated with the great king Jayavarman VII, the Buddhist king. So these statues have been found in Cambodia, of course, around Angkor, but also in Thailand and Laos as well. To the left, here is a gigantic head, if you can see the measurements in centimeters, I'm sorry. This is a quite colossal head of a god. We do not know his identification, but it's just a deva. And attempts to measure it, and we have also tried to photograph it in a round with the technique of photogrammetry, which then allow us, with some computer system, to play with it and try to find out more and study it more from our desk. And so this is another fine example coming from the so-called Bayon period of the 12th, 13th century of King Jayavarman VII. So what is the Bayon? The Bayon is the great temple of King Jayavarman VII at the center of his great capital of Angkor town. Okay? So you have to think of Angkor. Angkor is just a generic name like Paris. But throughout the period from the 9th to the 14th century, of course, there's been developments. Every new kings wanted to establish a new temple at the center. And so by the time of King Jayavarman VII, the new center is the Bayon, which represents a mountain, a cosmic mountain of Mount Meru, with representations of gods. And so these will be the city walls. And this is a gigantic scale. We're talking about, I don't have the measurements, but several kilometers or a couple of miles in dimensions. And the city walls have entrance gate, 5 of them. This is the southern, northern, western, and 2 towards the east. The most famous one for tourists these days who visit, if some of you have visited Angkor, most of tourists will enter the city through the southern entranceway. And so this is a view from the southern entranceway. As you can see on both sides, there are rows of statues of gods on the left and demons or asuras on the right. And these depict a Hindu cosmic legend or myth known as the churning of the ocean of milk in Hinduism. At the beginning of the world, there was no world yet. So the gods and the demons were acting in a sort of a tug of war, holding the giant snake or serpent to obtain the amrita or the nectar of immortality. Okay? So that's a well-known, famous history from the Puranas, the Hindu legends, which are represented here, uniquely represented in the capital of Angkor town. This is just an early drawing from Monsieur Moura. We will come back to this person, published in late 19th century, a drawing of one of the reliefs from the famous Angkor Wat temple. Okay? Angkor Wat is just one of the temples among many. And you do see here on both sides I'm not sure who or who. I think these are the devas, and these must be the asuras, the angels and demons, if you will. Close-up of images of the devas in situ. So our head will be one of those, an additional example of some of these. Mass-produced, we know of hundreds of these examples as coming from the Angkor temples or the gateways. And on the other side, the demons, okay, with their unique frowning aspect. And each head has its individual characteristics, so that's quite interesting. Okay, now, still behind the scene. In some cases, we had a possibility to do extra conservation analysis, technical analysis, including, for some important images in bronze, made of bronze, the possibility to conduct X-ray imaging. So this is one example. This is not to scale. This is a very small image, in fact, just a few inches in height, of a tantric Buddhist deity. And the reason why we wanted to X-ray it is to see the casting technique, how this image was cast. This clearly was is a solid cast because of its small dimensions. But what we notice here, and not surprisingly, really, is some breaks and probably later attempts to renovate this lower part, the pedestal, and probably the image and the pedestal were broken at some time. And these are just close-up images of that years ago, there was virtually no photographs of this, so part of the project was also to document this and taking new images of close-up. So all of this is now available to us online. So we can see the attributes of the deity, a back view, etc., etc. So you can enjoy all of this online now. Yeah, and just with the conservation reports confirming that there is no clay core inside the image, so this is not a hollow cast, but a solid cast. And there was definitely some repair joints in the metalwork around the base. The base is found here. So this is a tantric deity. We see a tantric Vajra trampling on a corpse. Okay, so we're talking about tantric Buddhism here in the late Angkor period. Back to our Shiva image, which is on view, by the way. Again, same process. X-ray allow us to better understand how it was cast. In this case, because of its size, it is a hollow cast. Okay, it's not solid. So we presume there must be some clay core inside, which unfortunately is not accessible to us at this time. But it would be great if we can have means to sample the clay core so that we can refine our analysis, the dating, etc., etc. But what is already apparent, quite apparent, from this image is that it's actually one of these rare examples of showing, in bronze casting practice, a casting flow. So, in fact, if you will, the casting was not successful. Okay? And that happens from time to time. And how do we know that? In particular, as you see, the missing left arm here, it's not just broken, but it was never there. Okay? And if you look some close-up, you see some darker areas on the back and the head. These were later renovations because, again, the casting was flawed. And so what we think, we cannot prove it, but what we think is that the missing arm was replaced by an additional lost wooden element, okay, which is no longer with us, unfortunately, again, holding probably the trident. Here's a close-up with probably the attachment of a wooden arm here. All right. Part of my work was also to look at archives internally first, what we have internally here at the Art Institute of Chicago, going through registers, old correspondence, curators' papers, etc., including the curators' papers of Charles Faben-Kele, one of our first curators in Oriental art, Asian art, from 1923 onwards for several decades. We have extensive documentations on Mr. Kele, since he stayed a long time with us. And we have correspondence, professional correspondence, exchange with other scholars at the time, curators. And here is a letter from Mr. Kumalaswamy, a well-known scholar and curator at the MFA Boston at the time, who write to Mr. Kele and inform him that his Khmer art collection that the Art Institute had just purchased at the time, in 1924, actually came from Monsieur Moura. Okay? The Moura belonged formerly to the Moura collection, a Frenchman on which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So these are registered cars, so this is pre-digital era. So, and most of it has not been, information you find there has not necessarily transcribed into our online database or system. So it's always useful for researchers to go back to the original documentation we have, because we do find things that were lost, forgotten over the years and decades. And for instance, here, so one of our early Khmer sculpture that came to us came from an art dealer known as Mr. C.T. Lu. So that's the direct provenance that we have. Okay? It doesn't tell us beyond that, all right? The purchase, the price, etc. And information which we have to scrutinize on provenance, the find spot, the original site. So this sculpture may have come from the Eastern Gate at Angkor Thom. So just to distinguish between what we call provenance and provenience here. Okay, so this is our Mr. Siti Lu, a well-known Asian art dealer at the time. He had a gallery in Paris, another one in New York City, and he was very popular. And he sold or even gifted works of art in many, many collections, including us here at the Art Institute. So the Moura collection, I've alluded briefly in some cases. So we do have 8 pieces of sculptures purchased in 1924, as I said, over 100 years old. And they were, we know from register, sold through Siti Lu. And we've just learned, thanks to Mr. Kumaraswamy, who wrote to our former curator here, just informed us that these objects came from Jean Moura, a Frenchman born in south of France, in Moissac. And who was Mr. Moura? Well, he was a French, initially a French Navy officer, an explorer, and one of these early pioneer scholars, what we call a Khmerologist, of ancient Khmer cultures, history, and art. We here still in the 19th century. He was appointed as one of the first official representative of the French Protectorate from 1868 to 1879. So that's 11 years of his time residing in Cambodia at the time, serving his official duties, representing the French government in Cambodia, who was a protectorate since 1963, if I'm not mistaken. Or 65, maybe. And gradually, as he was living there, he learned the language, he visited, he developed a great interest in the local history and culture. And eventually, towards his retirement, when he came back to France, he wrote books and articles about ancient Cambodia, etc., etc. Okay, so this was well known. So one of his great contribution is 2 large volumes, Le Royaume du Cambodge, the Kingdom of Cambodia, all aspects of art, history, culture, geography, etc., etc., that he had been able to collect at the time through his informants and long time journey in the region. And here and there you have drawings, not these drawings, but he has commissioned these drawings of pieces of art and cultures, objects that he has obviously seen at temples throughout the kingdom. And some of which came to us. That's interesting. So I've been able, I'm a Frenchman, by the way, so I've been able to pursue this work in the research in French archives, made several visits, been able to find ancient old photographs of Mr. Moura here and there. So here he is from the 1860s. So this is just the development, the emergence of photography in the region, 1860s. Here he is again with his mustache on the left in Cambodia. These are undated photographs, unfortunately, but we know this is in Cambodia. And to the right is the Hôtel du Protectorat. So that is basically his residence that he spent so many years in Phnom Penh, the modern capital of Cambodia, after Angkor. So just to recontextualize the colonial period here we're talking about, the French came in Cochin in lower Vietnam, Saigon, took over Saigon in 1862, and gradually expanded their control over Annam, so that's central Vietnam, eventually Tonkin in northern Vietnam, Cambodia. So the little kingdom of Cambodia at the time was fairly small. Why? Because the neighbor kingdom of Siam, today Thailand, was actually controlling part of what is today Cambodia. You see in pink, and Angkor would actually be, at the time, in the territory of the Kingdom of Siam. You see a close-up image here, the capital of Phnom Penh. you see the dividing line between Cambodia and Siam. And the Angkor complex in the late until the early 20th century was still in Siamese territory. Okay? So remind all this complexity, change of borders during up until the World War II, basically. So, pursuing my research on Monsieur Jean Moura, I've been able to visit his hometown in Moissac, southwest of France, lovely place. There's a Rue Jean Moura. This is the house he would have retired and spent many years. Unfortunately, it is completely abandoned today. There's no one living there anymore. But there has been, up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was some occupants there, not directly linked to the family anymore. The house has been sold over. But still, inside the house, up until recently, there were still some of his collection. Monsieur Jean Moura was also a collector. He had accumulated objects, things, papers, etc., from the region. And fortunately, it has now all been dispersed and sold in auction. So I've been able to look at papers on Monsieur Jean Moura in various centers and places in France and Europe. His official duties in the region, but also personal correspondence, etc., etc. And I did find a great deal on him. I've been able to retrieve some old photographs from his notes or from his widow, because Monsieur Jean Moura passed away quite early in 1885. But then his widow continued the legacy and had kept the collection until she passed away in 1922. So these are photographs which would probably have been taken in the early 20th century, showing some Khmer Angkorian period sculptures, which you may recognize are with us today. Okay? So these are early images when they were photographed in his house at the time, Jean Moura's house in Moissac. The colossal head of the Deva. The photograph is undated, but we know that it was kept in a corridor at the house. And this Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was adorning the dining room. Okay? We know the exact find spot of this image, thanks to his papers, which I found. It was found in a temple known as Ta Prohm. Now, there are several Ta Prohm, including one in Angkor, but this is not the one in Angkor, actually, which makes very interesting. We're talking about Ta Prohm of Tonle Bati, south of Phnom Penh, which makes sense. Another Bayon period temple of King Jayavarman VII. So here we are. This was basically the jurisdiction of Monsieur Jean Moura when Angkor or Siem Reap today was still in the territory of Siam. And I'd like to end this talk with a success story. As part of my research, so I was able to study this object, which is an architectural fragment, which we call a pilaster, adorning the entrance of a temple. And basic question I had, and we all have when we see an object for the first time, is where is this from? I mean, what can we say about this object? So formally, of course, there's been some studies before me, and it's been identified as a piece coming from Cambodia, from possibly the 11th century. And after doing some research on it, I've been able to reattribute the correct origin of this piece as coming not from what is today Cambodia, but actually Khmer temple located in northeast Thailand, known as Panom Rum. So we have been able to update and correct this attribution to northeast Thailand. And this has implication, as you will see. So I've been able to link this pilaster or fragment of a pilaster to another object that we formerly had in a collection up until 1988 of lintel. So lintel is an architectural fragment adorning the top of a door frame of a temple, and the pilaster would be on the sides. And so the association of these two objects as coming from the same side was very interesting. So a temple known as Phnom Rung in northeast Thailand. We have been able to pursue the provenance, the direct provenance. We had these objects coming from an art dealer based in New York who purchased these objects in Bangkok in the mid-60s. Okay? And that is as far as the provenance information that we had. We didn't know the ultimate finding spot, of course. But back in the 80s, and this is not my work, it's been done before me, we knew, and certainly Thai colleagues and scholars knew, that the lintel that was housed here in Chicago actually came from this temple of Phnom Rung. We had old photographs of the lintel in situ. The temple was abandoned in a decay and it's been restored since. Okay, so this is a photograph from early 1960s. And long story short, the Thai authorities decided to restore the temple of Phnom Rung in the 70s, 80s, and by 1988, they came to the Art Institute and say, hey, we would like to have our lintel back, please, because it's missing. So that's what happened. The Art Institute eventually returned the lintel to go back on site. Okay, so again, the map, Angkor Thom, Phnom Rung here in northeast Thailand, across the border. Not very far, but still. These are views of Phnom Rung Temple in northeast Thailand. Perhaps some of you have visited. This is another, what we call, very popular in Khmer architecture, so-called mountain temples. So temples basically are house of the gods. We're talking about Hindu gods here, Shiva or Vishnu. They live in mountains, just like Mount Olympus. And the mountains for the gods is usually Mount Meru or Mount Kailash. And so these temples represent that in cosmology. So as you ascend, literally ascend the temple through this long stairway here from east to west, you eventually reach the main tower, the main sanctuary. That is, of course, the most important, most sacred place in the temple, and that is where the lintel went back. Okay? It represents God Vishnu lying down. This is God Shiva. And what was missing at the time from the exact same door frame, as you can see, so these are pilasters. This one is in situ. And to the left, you see a missing pilaster here. So the blank stone has been, it's the restorer, the architects in the 80s, when they decided to restore the temple, they had a missing spot here, a gap. So they decided to use a blank stone so that we can see what is missing from the original decoration of the temple. And that is where I came up with the suspicion that the fragment of pilaster we had here was actually this very piece. Okay? Stylistically, definitely it matched. Okay? Even some Photoshop could let us think that it matched. All right? I had found an old photograph from the early 80s when the complete restoration was not yet done with the missing lintel that went back, and where I suspected that the pilaster would go. I've been able to look it up closely on site. So this is the remaining fragment on site, the top part, and this is the fragment that is here. And as you can see, the decoration, the foliage, these are mythical birds known as amsa or goose, and they are of the same type. And these are very rare representations. Okay? It's not like all temples look the same. They have some differences in style. Okay? So this is the fun part of the research, when you get to travel on site. obviously, in the winter especially. And so my site visit in winter 2023 was able to confirm all my suspicions, making all the measurements to the centimeters. So we were able to confirm definitely that this was a match. And so upon return, I was able to report my discovery to the museum leadership. All agreed that there was no doubt that this piece came from Phnom Rung and that we should return it, since we especially returned the lintel. There was a precedent. So we approached the Thai authorities. There is a Thai royal consulate here in Chicago, who were very delighted to learn about the news. And of course, this took several months of negotiations. We also welcomed the visit of the Thai ambassador from Washington, D.C. to discuss the case. And this is in process, repatriation, pending repatriation. We are waiting now to hear more from the Thai authorities as for the logistics of the return. But the object has been deaccession last year, officially. Yeah. So if you'd like to learn more on this, I wrote a little blog article, which you can find online. And that is coming to an end of my talk. So again, you can find, if you're curious enough, all about our collection, great collection of Khmer art, just by typing some keywords such as Khmer or Thailand, Cambodia, and you should be able to retrieve all our collection online with all we know about, which is sometimes not very much, but at least a photograph sometimes, or several, dimensions, provenance information, and maybe some other commentaries, publications, etc. So this has been updated to date. Okay. So coming to an end, in closing, the Khmer art preserved at the Art Institute of Chicago stands as a testament to a rich and enduring cultural legacy. The collection charts the remarkable production of sacred and royal objects across regions in Southeast Asia and across centuries. When we are able to reconnect these sculptures and fragments to their original context, their meanings deepen and their histories come into sharper focus. So ongoing, and of course this is still ongoing, provenance research continues to refine and clarify their trajectories, revealing stories that are often far more complex than previously understood. So none of this work obviously happens in isolation, and collaboration is essential with museums, scholars, and partners, including in Southeast Asia. Together, these efforts allow us not only to better understand these works, but also to honor cultural histories they embody. And I thank you very much. This is the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if any. Please raise your hands. I believe there are staff with microphone and send. Okay.
Hello. Thank you for the great lecture. Very informative. I just had a question about which pieces in the collection here, which ones are eligible for repatriation and why? And I was wondering also in perhaps the historical context where in the 60s there was a lot of political instability around Cambodia, and is there a relationship to how stuff got taken out of the country and how they're coming back to Thailand and Cambodia now?
Right. There's several questions here, and we could talk all night. Repatriation, restitution, returns, etc., are very complicated. This takes a lot of research, a lot of time. This may not be satisfactory, but I would say each case is different. I don't think we can adopt some, blanket policy that we return everything and where. We have to decide. As you can see, Khmer history is quite complex in a region. There are several stakeholders, countries involved. So we must do definitely our due diligence here, do the research, interpretation, and when we find things, when new information surface, then we may take actions if necessary. So I cannot, of course, reveal how many cases I've been working on. But you hear eventually stories in the news, not only from our museum, but other museums do the same thing. We have returned objects from other areas in the collection, not just mainland Southeast Asia. I think there's been a recent return from Nepal earlier this year. So the provenance research in general is a priority for the museum, and all museums, I should say, and sometimes, of course, in conversation with source countries, etc. So that's what I would say about this.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. The story is so interesting about how things develop. I'd like to ask you a bunch of questions, but
I've got till midnight.
Two things. One, it makes me think, of course, about the Elgin marbles in Britain, and if you think they'll ever be returned. And two, I would think the Art Institute, while it's wonderful to repatriate these objects, I would think they'd have mixed feelings about losing such beautiful art. Did they, with Thailand, make any kind of arrangement to share objects going back and forth?
Again, I don't have specific examples in mind, but yes, of course, these are very complex questions, issues. Britain, Europe, it's a different context. We talk about different colonial history that we don't have here in the US. US collection, as you know, are based on philanthropy mostly, gifts and purchases, not coming, with a few exceptions. We see the Moura collection coming eventually to us through convoluted ways, but in general, it's a different history, okay? So there is no similar case as you have just mentioned. We don't have to return everything, obviously, unless there are obvious evidence of case of lootings and stuff that we may learn. But we have to think, and I'll say we collectively in the museum world and with our partners in source countries, not just Southeast Asia, but I think we have to find ways, models of sharing, this legacy, showing it can take different forms, exhibitions, long-term loans. I mean, we can find different models, but I don't have an answer, but we can certainly make proposals. Certain countries have been very active recently doing this. Cambodia, certainly, if you're interested in learn more. There is, at the moment, a great exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art on Angkor bronzes until January, in partnership with the Ministry of Culture of Cambodia. This is a show that was organized by the Khmer Museum in Paris. Now it's here in the US, touring. So there are ways, of course, to show this world. And vice versa, we should also be able to show American art in Southeast Asia, right? So we have to find ways to exchange, right?
Thank you.
We have one right here.
Yes.
Don't worry, I'm not going to ask about repatriation. So, no, I'm actually proud of the fact that we're returning things. I think that's important. But my question is, you spoke quite a bit about your research and how you've gone about using technology to do your research. What have you noticed over the course of the last 10 years of your research that has changed within the museum community because of technological use during research?
Sure. Here, this is when I depend on other people. I can do my part. I'm an art historian. I can study style. I can go through archives. I read French. I read Thai. But I'm not an engineer. I'm not. So all these 3D models and fancy X-ray, I have to depend on other colleagues here. And I'm grateful for that here at the Art Institute for giving me this opportunity. It's certainly, we need to do much more, again, in general, doing technical analysis of bronze, stones, that can reveal, refine our dating and provenance information. When I mean provenance here, geographical origin of certain objects. different region, different kind of stones, etc., etc. So certainly, if we were to invest more in this area, we would learn much more. On the ground in Southeast Asia, so definitely in Angkor, over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a great technology known as LiDAR, you may have learned. So flying over the sites, and with all these laser going down and back, are able to give us very accurate mapping of the region through the jungle and etc. So now, our understanding of the mapping and urbanism of Angkor, the greater Angkor complex, has tremendously changed over the last 15 years, for example. Okay, so there are ways where we can, but then we need to interpret these results. So we still need brains and people who can, analyze this data, because raw data can be very difficult. Thank you.
And that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Nicolas.
Thank you.